do that. And we'll do this. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Friedman. I am a first-year student at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it is my pleasure and honor to play Zoom host for the ScholarStream series, which is a collaboration between JTS, Ziegler, Schechter, and the RA. This particular series is re-examining some of Zionism's key ideas, moments, and challenges from its earliest origins and into the 21st century. Tonight's session is titled Everywhere I Go, Affirming Our Rootedness in Zion and the Earth. And it will be ably taught by Rabbi Dr. Bradley Artson, who holds the Abner and Roslyn Goldstine Dean's Chair of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies and is Vice President of the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Rabbi Dr. Artson is also Dean of the Zacharias Frankel College in Potsdam, Germany, ordaining conservative rabbis for Europe. He is a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post, to the Times of Israel. He has written over 250 articles, most recently Renewing the Process of Creation, a Jewish Integration of Science and Spirit. Married to Alana Artson, they are the proud parents of twins, Jacob and Shira. We will have at least one opportunity to do Q&A this evening. Please send your questions directly to me, and I will curate them and ask them and address them to Rabbi Artson. Without further ado, everyone, I present to you Rabbi Dr. Bradley Artson.
Hi, everybody. It is lovely to see so many familiar faces. It is lovely to see a collection of some of my favorite Ziegler alumni who are here tonight. And it's also just a joy to all of us be together. So I wanted tonight to be a chance for us to share something personal. Because if you're like me, your relationship to Israel is complicated and personal. And so I have all kinds of relationships with Israel. And the central paradox I want to hold out to you tonight is that we're talking about a country that we're choosing not to live in, most of us. So here I am living my life in Los Angeles and thinking of Israel as one of my homes. And there are all kinds of ways that that becomes visible. So for example, this prayer stand is pointing towards Jerusalem. And the Siddur on top of the prayer stand is printed in Israel. And so in countless ways, I am thinking of Jerusalem. On my desk, I have above my papers a stone from Jerusalem so that I can always set Jerusalem above my chiefest joys. And one of my great delights in the work that I get to do is I get to travel to Israel every single year to check on the Ziegler and Frankel students and to meet with leaders of the Masorti movement there. And at the end of the day, I'm choosing to live my life in the United States. And I'm very much an American. I'm aware of that in my mannerisms. I'm aware of that in some of my preferences and certainly in my politics. And how do we reconcile that identity? Now, I'm not suggesting that you have the same conflicts I have. You don't have to. I just think that there are enough people giving us objective talks about Zionism that they miss the mark. And so I want to talk about the complications of my Zionism, hoping that it will resonate in yours as well, and that it'll give us a way to reflect on our own feelings and love for Israel and our frustrations and our complications and why many of us choose nonetheless to live elsewhere. So if you can download the source sheet, which Alex thoughtfully put in the chat. If you don't already have it and you haven't already done it, you can do that now. I make a point of, on my source sheets, doing two things. One is I try very hard whenever the original is in Hebrew or Aramaic to give you the original so that you know it's not just an English document. And two, at the bottom, you have ways to contact with me. And I'm happy for us to be in touch after this is over. If you have thoughts you want to share, points you want to make, feel free to be in touch with me. I can't promise long responses, but I do promise that I will attend to them, because if I'm going to get to spout off and say all these kinds of rabbinic platitudes, you certainly should have the right of rebuttal. So here's what I want to start with. We are, as 21st century Jews, given the rare privilege in Jewish life of having a deep rootedness in the earth as a whole, and simultaneously a deep connection to the land of Israel. And we have the privilege of enacting that dual relationship. Whenever I fly back from anywhere to the United States, I'm flying home. For me as a Californian, that's especially true when I hit the Rocky Mountains and I start to make my slow descent and I see the Pacific Ocean in front of me. She is my ocean. When I swim in her, I feel like I'm returning to my Earth Mother. And this is home in a very deep and profound ways. It's home in that my children live here, my wife lives here, and I'm old enough to know that wherever they live is home. On the other hand, I'm one of the few people left who, when I fly to Israel, I only fly El Al. I fly El Al despite all the reasons why you shouldn't fly El Al, but I fly El Al because my deceased mother-in-law, she should rest in peace, made me promise that I would always fly El Al. And she's a force of nature, my mother-in-law, and I don't want to get her upset. So I fly El Al. And whenever you get to the point in the flight where they show you, you suddenly see the land of Israel in the distance, corny though it is, I always sing Shalom Chavirim, and I always start to cry. And I will do that, I imagine, till my last flight to Israel. So there's a homecoming there, and there's a homecoming here. And I think that is actually the essence of Jewish identity for many of us today. America is my home, Israel is my homeland, and how I keep those two in dialogue together, how I remember Jerusalem wherever I am and affirm my Americanness wherever I am, that becomes the central dynamic of my Zionist identity and my Jewish life. Now, what I want to highlight for you now is that that's in fact found in the sacred traditions of our writings as well. So if you take a look at the first, I'm going to read these texts in English because I want to get through a bunch of them, and I want to make sure that everyone can follow. But if you'd like to follow in the Hebrew, that's printed thoughtfully there as well. So the first is the book of Genesis. Your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and your descendants. Now there at the very beginning, Molly, at the very beginning, we have the notion that we are meant to be everywhere. We are meant to spread out, and we are meant to have an impact on humanity as a whole. Excuse me, I'm going to let the dog out of the room because otherwise we're going to hear this all. Sorry about that. In addition to all the other excitement in my life, we're meeting the Machatanim tonight for the first time. So you guys are the warm-up act. So, look that we are, in the terms of our identity, it's already determined that we're supposed to be everywhere. And that everywhere is a mission, right? The mission is to live in such a way that humanity blesses itself by us. Now that's a heavy obligation. That's not a metaphysical difference. It's not that Jews are other than non-Jews. It's that we are meant through our devotion to the values of Torah to make human life better everywhere. We're supposed to help people thrive, right? And in that regard, people will then bless themselves by us and our descendants. Take a look at this verse from the prophet Jeremiah. Thus says the Holy One, the God of Israel, to the whole community which I exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease, and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Holy One on its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. Now, that's an interesting charge from the prophet who himself saw the destruction of Jerusalem and marched with the children of Israel out of Israel into exile. And he tells them, when you get there, don't think you're just biding your time till you come back. Your well-being is now tied up in their well-being. Wherever you live, you should be praying for the well-being of that place. The welfare of your city is now your business as a Jew, right? So we're not supposed to simply be from somewhere. We're supposed to be of that somewhere. It's supposed to be wedded to our own personality. Jeremiah again, if you remain in Bavel, I will build you and not overthrow. I will plant you and not uproot, for I regret the punishment that I have brought upon you. Boy, this is a fascinating verse. We could talk about this one for an hour all by itself. Notice that God here is admitting to having made a mistake. So I just want to point out to you, you should be able to start practicing that as well. It's godlike to be able to say, I screwed up and I apologize. God does it here so that we can do it too, right? And God is saying, I really apologize for how I punished you. And if you choose to stay here, that's okay. You can go back to Jerusalem. You can stay in Bavel. Those are two options. And I will bless you, whichever of those you do. From the prophet Micah, the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Holy One, like droplets on grass, which do not look to any person nor place their hope in mortals. Do you see a recurrent pattern in these quotations? The prophet Micah is saying that you will be like the dew. There's nothing gained by having all the dew in one barrel in one spot. Dew works best when it's spread out. Right? And so the work of the Jews is to be like the dew. It's to help everything be moist and ripe and full of life. And that's our function. Malachi, great is the Holy One beyond the borders of Israel. Mi'al ligvul Yisrael. And then my favorite of the rabbinic statements, this is from the Tanhuma, which is a 9th century rabbinic midrash. God began to gather the body of Adam from the four corners of the world, so that the earth should not say, the dust of your body does not come from me. So that if he was taken from the east and expires in the west, the western part of the earth should not say, the dust of your body is not from me, so I'm not accepting it. Therefore, God took it from the four corners of the world, so that wherever he dies, the earth should accept him, as it is stated, for you are dust. Now let's remember a couple things. One, is Adam a Jew? No, Adam is not a Jew. Adam is just an earthling, just a person, right? And what it's saying is that all of us, I'm going to say something politically loaded here, all of us are indigenous everywhere. You understand that? We are indigenous to the whole planet. Turns out that's biologically true. Right? Humans have been wandering since we stood upright. We have been wandering out of the savannas of Africa. We wandered across Europe. We wandered across Asia. We haven't stopped wandering. We still do, right? And what this is saying is that human beings are literally natives of the whole planet. So you might think there's a particular place you come from. As a Jew, there's certainly a particular place we come from. But as a human being, you should be at home wherever you are. You are as much a product of that part of the world as you are of any other part of the world, right? And that's our heritage as human beings. All people are at home everywhere. All right, I want to stop now before we get into the Zion part and see if there are any comments or questions you wanted to make now. Alex, what do you think?
I will give folks a moment to write any comments they might have. So far, they have not. I have a question for you, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
The Jeremiah text where God regrets sending the Jewish people out and says that, I regret that I brought you out. Are we to understand that as saying that being in exile is at best second best? That actually it's a result of a mistake God made? Or is it to be understood as on equal footing despite its origins?
Right. So that's great, because your translation of Jeremiah contains an interpretation. God doesn't say, I regret having exiled you. God regrets the punishment I've brought on you. Al-hara'ah, all the evil which I have done to you. Is that evil the exile? Is that evil the destruction of the temple, the blinding of the king, the dethroning of the king, the murder of the youths and the maids? Like, there was a lot of bad stuff going on. I don't recall in Jeremiah God apologizing for the exile. But there is a dynamic tension. So there is a way in which Jews are in their native element when they're in the land of Israel. And at the same time, and I know it's a contradiction, the Tanakh has all these texts that talk about the mission that we can only fulfill in exile. So you want to say to me, but Rabbi, how can both of those be true? They contradict each other. And I want to say, you're right, nonetheless. They are both assertions of the tradition. And so the question is, how can those truths live together? How can they accommodate each other?
We have one question so far from Beth Ann, who was wondering, I never thought of someone claiming that there is a metaphysical difference between the Jews and other people. Have any theologians or philosophers written that there is? It's a broad question, but I imagine it will.
The answer is yes. I will give you the short version of the answer. Yehuda Halevi believes that you are either born a Jew or you're a non-Jew. You can convert to Judaism. You can be a Gentile who practices Judaism if you want, but you're still not a Jew. And he believes that Jewish souls are different than Gentile souls. For those of you who like Chabad or flirt with Chabad, the great foundational document of Chabad is the Tanya, which is a wonderful, although racist book. And in it, it explains that the souls of Gentiles compared to the souls of Jews are like the souls of donkeys. So yes, there is a strong stream, mostly in the mystical parts of Jewish tradition. The Jewish philosophers didn't think that. Rambam notoriously says that once you convert, you are as much a Jew as any Jew. But there is certainly in the Kabbalah and in the Hasidic tradition a very strong circle of people, not all of them, but a strong circle who believe that the Jewish neshama is metaphysically superior to the Gentile.
If we have time, I think we have one more question for now.
Okay.
Can Rabbi Artson, if the human being is native everywhere, can Rabbi Artson talk about the state of exile? What does it represent to be exiled when you're native everywhere? How does it manifest?
Really an important question. So if on some level as a human, we're at home everywhere, then I think exile consists of two different things. The first is none of us are just human, right? So I am a human and an American and a Jew and a San Franciscan in exile in Los Angeles. Let's not even start in on that. And I'm a husband and a father and a son and a brother. Like, I'm all these different identities. So exile is partly when the components of your identity have division, are not fully integrated, or when parts of your identity aren't able to be satisfied. So I joke, but it's not a joke. I will spend my whole life feeling like an exile from San Francisco, right? And I'm not the only one from San Francisco who feels that way. Imagine my shock when I learned that there are people from Los Angeles living in the Bay Area feeling like they are exiles, which is just perverse, let's be honest. So, so I think exile has to do with the add-on parts of our identity. As a human being, there is no such thing as exile. There's none. But as a Jew, I definitely have a sense of exile. Um, and as many other parts of my component, there are exiles from that part of myself that's home. The second thing is, I think, existential. We are all of us wandering, right? We're all on a journey in life, and all of us in life are giving up things we love. Now, some of that is temporal, which is people who are no longer alive, places we no longer live, schools we no longer attend, friends we haven't been in touch with. So all of us live our lives with a sense of being on a journey that removes us from people or places or times that we love. My son Jacob likes to quip when I start getting all lyrical about San Francisco. He says, "Abba, you don't miss San Francisco, you miss the 70s. You miss being a teenager." And there may be some wisdom to that too, cruel though it is. All right, let's jump back in the text. So we talked about the way that Judaism itself in its text assumes that we are in exile and gives us a job to do. We are to be or l'goyim, a light to the nations. We are meant to be like the dew that sprinkles on the grass. We have a job to do vis-a-vis the rest of humanity. Judaism is not solipsistic. It's not for our own pleasure. It's for what we do out. But there's another side to it. So look at this verse from Deuteronomy at the bottom of page 1. It is a land which the Holy One your God looks after, on which the Holy One your God always keeps an eye from beginning to year's end, right? There's a way in which the land of Israel holds a special place in God's heart, but then let's be honest, it's us who are saying that, right? So it's in Jewish literature that we portray God as having this intense love affair with the land of Israel. In Kiddushin, the Talmud, 10 measures of wisdom descended to the world. The land of Israel took 9 and all the world took 1, right? That is to say that, as the tradition says elsewhere, the heir of Israel will make you wise, right? That just being in that spot brings a wholeness and a completeness and a unification of your soul that makes you wise. 10 measures of beauty descended to the world. Jerusalem took 9 and all the world took 1. Now, I don't want you to evaluate, is that factually true? Let's assign a point value to Yosemite and the Grand Canyon and the Kotel. Like, that's not what we're doing here. What this is an expression of an emotional relationship, right? This is someone saying, when I think about Jerusalem, it just so fills me up, unlike any other place I look at. This is about your connection to the land of Israel, right? And that it is so beautiful in my eyes that it looks to me like it's 9/10 of the world's beauty. In Kiddushin, look, commenting on the verse from Deuteronomy, you shall arise and ascend to the place that the Holy One your God will choose. This teaches that the holy temple is higher than all the rest of the land of Israel, and that the land of Israel is higher than all other lands. I love that. I love that. I just want to remind you, when you land at Ben Gurion and you start to go to Jerusalem, you do in fact go uphill. That's where the Aliyah comes from. You are going up, 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 And then you get to the crest and suddenly Jerusalem lays out in front of you. It always takes my breath away, right? But the rabbinic chutzpah is to not leave it there, but to say beyond that. And the same way Jerusalem is the highest point of the land of Israel, Israel is the highest point in the world, right? Now, we know that that can't be geographically true. If the planet is a sphere, it doesn't mean much to say that. And by the way, they knew that the planet was a sphere, right? They already knew by the early Middle Ages that the Earth is a globe. So again, they're making a statement of their feelings. They're turning their feelings into something external. It's as though Israel is the pinnacle of the world and Jerusalem is the pinnacle of Israel, right? Hear that as a statement of devotion. Dwelling in the land of Israel is equivalent to all the other commandments of the Torah put together. I don't know if you do, I've encountered Israelis who will not leave the land of Israel because of verses like this, because they say there's nowhere to fulfill Torah like Israel, and so I'm not going out ever, right? We fought for too long to be able to have access to this place, so I'm going to stay in it always, right? And that comes from this kind of statement that being in the land is itself more mitzvah observant than keeping kosher outside the land. Ben-Gurion was famously noted to have said that a street sweeper in Tel Aviv was a better Jew than the president of the Federation in New York, right? He's not knocking the president of the Federation per se, but he's saying that your primary Jewish expression is living in our land. And once you've done that, you've done more than anyone outside can possibly do. Anyone who walks even 4 cubits in the land of Israel is assured of the world to come, right? There again, an incredible statement that if you want to have a sense of Olam Haba, the world to come, take a walk in Israel, right? It's as close to paradise as we get. And they're saying it will guarantee you admission. What a thing to say. And then Moshe Cordovero, one of the early Kabbalists. The land of Israel and the Torah have a closeness and a relationship similar to that of the life force to the heart. It is more meritorious to perform the commandments in the land than it is to do so outside. So we saw a bunch of quotations that talk about our mission elsewhere, our mission out in the world. And then here comes these quotations that say, no, 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 no. There is nothing equivalent to being in Israel, to occupying the land, to dwelling in it, right? And these are legitimate and authentic quotations from our holy sages, and those are legitimate and authentic quotations from our holy sages. And when I read the one, I smile and I nod and I say yes. And when I read the second, I say, I know what that feels like. I totally get that. So the question I want to turn to you with is, what do we do with those? Because on one level, those are incompatible, one or the other. It's just as valuable to live in the world as it is to be in the land of Israel. In fact, Jews living outside of Israel are fulfilling their core Jewish mission in ways that are not possible to those Jews who are in the land of Israel. Or Jews are meant to be in our own land. And in that land, we can breathe deeper, our brains function better, our souls are unfettered, and only there do the commandments resonate as something organic and natural. Those are what the texts are laying out. And I want to just highlight again how weird and wonderful it is to be part of a tradition that says both, right? Clearly, not every Jew agreed on every point. not even the big ones. And so this becomes for us a possibility. How do we embrace the two? How do we turn them not into opposition, but in complementary views, that one aspect of my being is addressed by one collection of these quotations, and another aspect of my being is embraced by another aspect of these quotations. I'm going to stop here again, and I'm interested to hear anything you want to say. So back to you, Alex.
Andy asks about this section we've just finished. How is this more than mere tribalism? My place is better than everything else. Rabbinic and human chutzpah indeed.
Well, I guess I want to start by asking if tribalism is always mere. Is it tribalism? Sure, you say that as though it's a bad thing. But I think tribalism is how most of us live. Most of us are more loyal to our family than we are to people who aren't relatives. We're more loyal to our friends who are closer to us than the stranger on the street. There have been preachers over time who preach a kind of radical universalism in which you attend to the stranger no less than to the people who you're related to, and I can tell you their children resent it. So isn't it a legitimate human striving to say that I owe more to the people who are close to me, who are dependent on me, than those who are not? I think the challenge is, can we broaden our tribalism so that we see elements of Landsman in everybody eventually, but in different degrees? So yes, there is tribalism here, but I think it's unapologetic tribalism. There's nothing wrong with being part of a family. There's nothing wrong with being part of a tribe.
Thank you. Bruce asks, living in a generation as we do, in which the land of Israel is a sovereign Jewish nation and God's prophecies for the Jewish people are fulfilled, how do we reconcile our place in history against all those who never lived to see this realization?
That is a really great question. I have my great-grandfather's tefillin. Everybody knows what tefillin are, those prayer boxes that make Jews look so attractive in the eyes of the world. So I'm aware, I take them with me when I go to Israel. And I remember the first time I stood on the Merpeset in my hotel, looking at the walls of the old city, putting on my great-grandfather's tefillin and thinking, this would be messianic to him, right? That his great-grandson was still Jewish would be a long shot, but that his great-grandson was wearing his tefillin in a Jewish Jerusalem. Utterly miraculous. And I think we blind ourselves to that miracle. We don't let ourselves feel how incredibly unlikely that is, how incredibly resonant it is. I wouldn't say that God's prophecies have come true, but we are living them. We are living those prophecies. The ability that I have to get on a plane and be in Israel in a moment's notice is not to be taken for granted by our generation, nor should that lead us to be blind to the ways that we need to continue to help Israel be a better democracy, just as patriots of America, we help America be a better democracy as we see it, but always from a place of love, and always from a place that I think I am doubly blessed. I think being a citizen of this country, despite its considerable flaws, is one of the greatest blessings in my life, and I owe that to my great-grandparents. And then being able to be a Jew in a time when Israel is an independent and Jewish state is just off the charts.
I think we have one more question for now. Lynn asks, referring to the kind of effusiveness of the quotes we just read, did the oppression of the times of the sages writing on the second page make them see Israel as a land of hope we so privileged cannot know of?
You know, I'm always reticent to draw a simple line between this historical thing happened and therefore people think that. People are way more complicated than that. I think what ends up happening most of the time is that historical experience gets filtered through our own presuppositions and confirm us in the belief we had before the historical event that we mobilize as a proof. Did everybody follow what I just said? Right. So we live through the pandemic right now. And those of us who believe that we should be engaged in the betterment of groups not like ourselves will say, because we lived through the pandemic, we know that we need to pay more attention to other people and their suffering. And those people who felt that what we needed to do before the pandemic was double down and pay more attention to our own will say, what we learned from this pandemic is we need to double down and pay more attention to our own. People use their experiences mostly to justify their previously held convictions. So I think the rabbis are informed by their own personality, by their reading of the tradition, by their loyalty to Torah and their honest attempt to make the Torah real in their lives. All of that is true. And there were different sages who have different positions. Now, some of these are not named, like it doesn't say Rabbi Meir said this, so we could know he has a particular slant on this, but the sages were just as diverse then as the sages are now. But I think what is sincere is their love for Eretz Yisrael, their sense of it as a special and unique place and as a God-given gift. I think that's pretty pervasive throughout the tradition. What shifts from the Talmud, from the Bible to the Talmud, is it looks like more or less in the Bible, the doing of mitzvot is rewarded by dwelling in the land. And for the rabbis, by and large, the dwelling in the land is rewarded by doing mitzvot. But they value both. All right, let's go on. We have a couple more quotes, and I want to get to my grand finale. So the challenge and the paradox. Here's the paradox we've encountered so far. There's a verse from Eruvi that says, Ubavel have ruba d'alma, is Babylonia most of the world? This was said by an indignant proto-Zionist rabbi who thought that the Babylonian rabbis were acting like they were the center of the Jewish universe, and he got annoyed. To which the response in Kiddushin, Vihuda have ruba d'alma, is Judea the center of the world? Right? So even within the Talmud, you're getting people who are taking cracks at where other Jews live, and pointing out that for a lot of Jews, that isn't the center of the world. In Kiddushin, one of my favorite lines, Vihuda ve'od mikra, is Judea in addition to Scripture? Meaning, if you want to argue that you do things Jewishly because of the land of Israel, you're elevating the land of Israel up to the status of Scripture. And there was someone back in the Talmud who found that offensive, right? So you get all of these complicated things. Babylonia doesn't get to speak for the Jewish people. Israel doesn't get to speak for the Jewish people, according to different rabbis. And then I want to share with you two more contemporary quotes. This one from Hans Jonas, who's one of the unfortunately least known modern Jewish thinkers, but you're doing yourself a disservice not to get to know Hans Jonas. He's a brilliant refugee of Nazi Germany, lived in Israel for a while, ended up teaching at the New School in New York for most of his career, wrote astonishing philosophical and ethical works. He writes, Palestine is not a refuge from the vicissitudes of the Golah, it is the avant-garde of the Golah. What does that mean? I think what he's saying is, don't think that moving to Israel means you're not in Galut anymore. The whole world is in Galut. If Galut is, we no longer can do God's will perfectly, then you're in Galut even if you live in the old city of Jerusalem. The opinions of the world will waft in. The politics of the world will waft in. The social mores of the world will waft in, not just to Tel Aviv, right, but to all of the land of Israel. And in some ways, it's more intense. right? Because paradoxically, the first place to know exile wasn't the Galut. The first place was Judea when the Jews got expelled, right? And so he's saying that contemporary Israel is not a refuge from Galut. It might be a place where you could live where most of the people who live with you are Jewish. But the struggles of being Jewish in a non-Jewish world, they will find you out, even in the land of Israel. Second, from Leo Strauss, professor of Maimonides studies at the University of Chicago. The establishment of the state of Israel is the most profound modification of the Galut which has occurred, but it is not the end of the Galut. In the religious sense, and perhaps not only in the religious sense, the state of Israel is part of the Galut. Right? So I know we're saying some dicey things here. So I'm going to hide behind Strauss for a minute. I think what Strauss is saying is take a look at the issues that have to deal with the governance of the land of Israel. And they're not so different. What does it mean to be Jewish? What's our commitment to democracy? What rights do we owe the citizens? There's a whole, how do we deal with the tensions between the United States and Russia? How do we deal with managing our neighbors? What do we do with European anti-Semitism? Like all of these things will find you out, and the government of Israel spends a good deal of time battling those same issues, right? And in that sense, it may be a huge modification that it's in Hebrew among Jews trying to hold their government accountable to Jewish criteria. But at the end of the day, they're dealing with the same kinds of issues that governments deal with anywhere. So I want to wrap up with these last quotes on page 3. From Ta'anit, those who desire to should go up. I would like that to be one of the watchwords of the conservative movement. We absolutely should support those people who desire to make Aliyah. It's a beautiful thing. And we should bless them and support them and stand with them in that desire. But we also need to support the people who want to be in New Jersey or Texas or Florida or Ohio or wherever. The right of Jews to live anywhere they want to live should be our mission. And making sure that they thrive wherever they live should be our mission. Those who desire to make Aliyah should do it with our blessings and our support. And those who don't should also see us supporting them living a meaningful, deep, vibrant Jewish life. Years ago, I was given the opportunity to launch a rabbinical school in Berlin. And you can understand why that's kind of a complicated, emotional thing to do. And I remember arguing with a donor who said, you should not be doing that. You should be, whatever rabbinical school you open, it should be either in Israel or here. And I said, first of all, LA doesn't have a privileged place in the world, right? And second of all, Jews don't ask me where they should live. It's not like anyone says, I'm thinking of moving to Berlin. I should check with Rabbi Artson to get his opinion on the subject. If they ask, I'd say, are you out of your mind? But they don't ask. They move to Berlin anyway. So the question that I'm facing is not, should Jews live in Berlin? The question I'm facing is, do we want to teach their children Judaism or not? Do we want them to have access to rabbis and synagogues so they can stay Jewish, even though they've made the independent choice of living in Berlin? And to me, it seems that's self-evident. So those who desire to go up, they should go up. And those who don't, they should not. I'm going to skip down to Solomon Schechter. Zionism declares boldly to the world that Judaism means to preserve its life by not losing its life. It shall be a true and healthy life with a policy of its own, a religion wholly its own, invigorated by sacred memories and sacred environment, and proving a tower of strength and of unity, not only for the remnant gathered within the borders of the Holy Land, but also for those who shall, by choice or necessity, prefer what now constitutes the Galut. Here, I just want to say in his praise, there are very few Jewish thinkers from the 1900s who are still worth reading, and everything written by Solomon Schechter should be carved into granite. The man was extraordinary, and his thinking is still relevant to us today. So look what he's saying. There is something special about Jewish life, and Zionism at its best is not about replicating all the foibles of Jewish life, but of creating something worthy and distinctive and beautiful, so that Judaism as practiced in Israel should not be like Judaism practiced elsewhere. And being in that sacred place with its history and its environment, that should be a force for unity, not only for the Jews of Israel, but for the Jews around the world. How's that for a criteria to decide, is Israel doing its job? Right? Notice that for Schechter, it's not about mere biological survival. It's about, we are a people on a mission, and Israel should be advancing that mission. It should be itself augmenting strength and the unity of the entire people. But then his last kicker, this is a brave man, is that those who by choice or necessity stay in Galut, they get to make that choice. And they still have a special relationship to the land of Israel and to Zionism in Israel. That's our charter. That feels so, so powerful to me. And here's what I want to close with, and then we'll have time for some more comments or questions. Carl Shapiro is an American poet from several years ago. He wrote this right after, few years after the establishment of the State of Israel. When I think of the liberation of Palestine, he means by that Zionism, when my eye conceives the great black English line spanning the world news of 2,000 years, my heart leaps forward like a hungry dog. My heart is thrown back on its tangled chain. My soul is hangdog in a Western chair. When I think of the battle for Zion, I hear the drop of change, the starting forth of feet, and I remain chained in a Western chair. My blood beats like a bird against a wall. I feel the weight of prisons in my skull falling away. My forebears stare through stone. When I see the name of Israel high in print, the fences crumble in my flesh. I sink deep in a Western chair and rest my soul. I look the stranger clear to the blue depths of his unclouded eye. I say my name aloud, for the first time unconsciously. Speak of the tillage of a million heads no more. Speak of the evil myth no more of one who harried Jesus on his way, saying, "Go faster." Speak no more of the yellow badge, secta nefaria. Speak the name only of the living land. Thank you, everybody. Happy to take comments, questions, thoughts.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Artson. I think you addressed this, but I think Randy would appreciate going a little further. Randy asks, to what degree should Jews not living in Israel have the right to say what Israel should or should not be doing politically?
Okay, so I have a complicated answer to that. Jews who are not citizens of Israel should not have a vote. Okay, but don't confuse not having a vote with not having an opinion, right? We Jews have opinions about everything. And that is our birthright in two directions. First of all, it's our birthright as Jews. You see from the Talmud here, there are opinions about everything. So if you have an opinion, you have the right to have that opinion. You don't get to register to vote unless you're a citizen, but you get to have an opinion. So I have opinions about aspects of Korea and Korean policy. I have opinions about Argentina and some of the things they're doing. And I certainly have the right to have an opinion about stuff that Israel's doing. And I can share those opinions with anyone who's going to listen to me, with one complication. I think there are enough people who are trying to destroy the state of Israel that I'm very careful about what I say publicly, right? And I'm careful for the following reason. If I'm critical of something in Great Britain, nobody says, aha, you see, Rabbi Artson thinks Great Britain stinks, and so we should get rid of it. If I knew that when Rabbi Artson was critical of a policy of Israel, the only thing people would say is, we should change the policy, then I might be willing to go more public. But until that day, I'm very discreet about who I share my criticisms with. I only share them in private. I only share them with Israelis or with involved Jews who will understand that whatever criticisms I have are about specific policies, not about the existence of the state of Israel or of Zionism. Different rabbis have different policies. That's their right. I actually support rabbis to disagree with me on that, but those are my feelings. That having been said, I do not think that loyalty to a place means not being critical. I think to the contrary, to be a patriot is to engage in constructive criticism. And those who love Israel owe Israel the benefit of their wisdom and their insights, but you don't get to vote.
Paul, and thank you, Rabbi. Paul and Brent ask what I think is a helpful follow-up. Does Israel have an obligation to consider how their actions affect Jews in the diaspora who don't have a vote? Or should they act only out of what's best for Israel?
So I'm going to engage in a higher duplicity by insisting that those diverge only apparently. In the long run, and you can call me naive if you want, but I don't think I am. In the long run, history arcs towards morality, towards decency, towards justice, and in the long run, the Jewish people are one. We are one cantankerous, argumentative group of people, but we are linked. And so I do not believe that in the long run, there is a permanent disparity between what is in Israel's best interests and what is in the best interests of the Jews.
Thank you, Rabbi. In the meantime, while folks continue writing in their questions, I'm going to briefly mention next week's session in our ScholarStream series, May 5th, same time, same station. We'll be hearing from Rabbi Professor David Galinkin, who is the president of Schechter Institutes in Israel, and he will be discussing religion and state in Israel, a Zionist dilemma. And while I was saying that, Jay had another question for you, Rabbi Artson.
Yes.
Jay and Lane have largely the same question. Can Judaism exist without Israel? And Lane asks, is there a central Jewish narrative of the Jews in diaspora today beyond the relationship to Israel?
So let me tell you why I have a hard time with that question. You ask it as though those are abstractions, which one can have a philosophical position about. But you can't, because they're not abstractions. So let me ask you, which is your more important organ, your heart or your brain? And you're going to say to me, that's a klutzkasha, right? I need both of them. I can't live without either one. So here's the thing. If all the Jews were ingathered in the land of Israel, we would figure out a way to make that work. In the time when there wasn't a Jewish state in the land of Israel, we figured out how to make that work. I will not contemplate a scenario in which there isn't an Israel, and I will not contemplate a situation in which there's not a rich, strong diaspora. Thank God we live in a time where we have both, and it is the job of Jews to strengthen both, because it's not like these are two separate things. They're interrelated all the time. How many of us have relatives and friends who live in diaspora or in Israel? My college roommate has lived his entire adult life in Israel. My brother-in-law has raised my nieces and nephews in Israel. Some of my best friends are Israelis who live in Israel, Americans who made Aliyah, or Israelis who moved here. I won't make that. I'm not separate from that place. That place is part of who I am everywhere I am. And at the same time, I am a profoundly American person. The story that I resonate to above all is the story of people from all around the world coming together in a shared commitment to freedom, imperfectly understood and in expanding circles in every generation. That's the American story. And that's my core story. But my other core story is of a group of slaves leaving Egypt who took with them all the discontents who thought Egypt was bunk and wanted to create a radically different kind of place. It turns out the American story and the Israelite story are very similar, right? And maybe that's why I love both of them so much. So I don't want to choose between those stories.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. C asks, if you could emphasize one aspect of educating our children who are in diaspora about Israel, what would it be?
Here's what I said to my daughter. I told Shira at her bat mitzvah, I gave the best bat mitzvah speech in the history of our species because it was the shortest. I said to her, honey, being a Jew is the greatest privilege you didn't earn. And now you spend the rest of your life earning it. And two, I need you to love Israel. And the only way to love Israel is to spend time there. Israel isn't a concept. Israel isn't a book. Israel is a live, real, messy place. And you can only love it by experiencing it. So you must go to Israel after your high school year. I don't care which program you pick. And indeed, she picked a program I wouldn't have picked. It was a wonderful program for her. I'm a bookish kind of guy. I'd have been stuck in a library and a Beit Midrash if I had the choice. She didn't want to do that. So she worked at Eileen Hospital, working with special needs kids for half the year. Then she worked in Tel Aviv with the children of foreign immigrants and loved it. And I knew when I had succeeded when two things happened. We were talking on Zoom, and she told me about her favorite sushi restaurant in Jerusalem. And I thought, someone who has a favorite sushi restaurant in Jerusalem has passed over to the side I need them to be on. And the second thing, her group of collegians took a trip while they were there. They saved up money. They went to Rome. And in Rome, they were wandering around and they got to the Arc of Trajan, which you know is Titus's Arch, which has the scene of the Romans marching our menorah out of the temple towards Rome as stolen goods. And there was a group of tourists nearby, and the tour guide was explaining that this is how the Italians got these things and that they're understood to be in the papal vaults somewhere. And my daughter Shira, who has a volume control issue, said loudly enough that you could hear it from here. She said, F you, that's ours, give it back. To no one in particular. Like, she just said that to the universe. And then she called me to tell me that that's what she said. And I said, honey, you can come home. You have now learned everything I need you to know. You need to learn who's them, and you need to learn who's us, and you need to learn that what's ours belongs to us, and you need to have a favorite sushi restaurant in Jerusalem. Come on home. You can't teach people to love Israel by having hummus and falafel parties, or even by reading Israeli poetry. Israel isn't a concept. It's a real place. So you need to take some vacations there, and you need to visit the family there, and you need to spend time there, and then you need to make sure that every Jewish kid spends their gap year after high school in Israel. I don't care which program they go on. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the time together.
Thank you, Rabbi Artson, and thank you all for being here this evening. It is a beautiful thing when the Jewish people come together to learn Torah. Have a good night, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.